The wind did not howl so much as it whispered a death sentence across the high plains, a low and constant sibilance that promised nothing but an end to all things warm and living. May stood amidst the endless, blinding white of the Wyoming basin, the tracks of the wagon that had brought her here already vanishing under the relentless drift of fresh snow. She wore only an old brown prairie dress, the fabric thin and stiff with frost, offering no defense against a temperature that sought to freeze the very marrow in her bones. The laughter of the men who had left her, men who had promised a marriage, a home, a future, only to reveal their cruelty as a monstrous punchline, had long since faded into the storm, swallowed by the vast indifference of the frontier. She did not weep, for tears would only freeze upon her cheeks, and she had learned long ago, in a life defined by displacement and loss, that the world had no pity for the sorrow of a woman alone. She looked down at her hands, the skin turning a mottled shade of violet and gray, and realized with a terrifying clarity that she was becoming part of the landscape, a statue of ice to be buried until the spring thaw revealed what the cruelty of strangers had wrought. The cold was a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, forcing her knees to buckle, and as she sank into the deep powder, the brown of her dress looked like a withered leaf falling upon a frozen pond. There was no anger left in her heart, only a quiet, permeating numbness that began at her fingertips and crept slowly inward, shutting down the lights of her body one by one until the gray sky above began to blur into a singular, dark tunnel. Silas found her not because he was looking for a person, but because he was a man who noticed when the geometry of his land had been disturbed. He was a creature of these high elevations, a rancher who lived in a silence so profound it felt like a companion. And as he rode the perimeter of his fence line to check for breaks before the blizzard worsened, his eye caught the unnatural shape in the drift. It was a mound of brown disruption in a sea of perfect white, too large to be a coyote and too still to be a stray calf. He guided his horse, a roan mare as stoic and hardened as he was, through the belly-deep drifts, the animal snorting clouds of steam into the biting air. When he reached the shape and realized it was a woman, curled into herself like a child in the womb, a jolt of shock pierced through his usual reserve. He dismounted, his boots crunching heavily, and knelt beside her, his gloved hands brushing away the snow that had already begun to claim her. She was small, fragile as a bird, her dark hair frosted with ice, her face pale as milk save for the blue tint of her lips. Anger, hot and sudden, flared in his chest, not at the storm, which was only doing what storms did, but at the impossibility of her being here alone. He knew, with the instinct of a man who understood the cruelty of the territory, that this was no accident. "Easy now," he murmured, though he knew she could not hear him, his voice rough from disuse. He scooped her up, amazed by the terrible lightness of her, and felt the terrifying lack of heat radiating from her body. She was a candle whose flame had been pinched out, leaving only the faintest wisp of smoke. The cabin was a fortress of solitude built from hewn logs and mud, a singular point of warmth in a world determined to remain cold. Silas kicked the heavy door shut against the wind, instantly cutting off the shrieking gale and replacing it with the crackle of the hearth and the scent of pine pitch and old wool. He did not waste time with propriety. Survival was a brutal master that allowed for no hesitation. He laid May upon the buffalo hide rug before the fire, the orange light dancing across her frozen features, and began the desperate work of saving her life. He chafed her hands and feet, his large, rough palms moving with a surprising gentleness, trying to coax the blood to return to the extremities without damaging the fragile skin. He added logs to the fire until the heat in the room was stifling, sweat beading on his forehead, yet she remained deathly still, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that barely lifted her chest. He stripped the frozen brown dress from her, wrapping her instead in thick woolen blankets heated near the flames, creating a cocoon of warmth to trap whatever life remained within her core. For hours, the only sounds were the popping of the fire and the wind tearing at the eaves outside. Silas sat on a low stool beside her, watching her face for a flicker of pain or consciousness, his own heart beating a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. He was a man who had made peace with death, having seen it take cattle, horses, and kin, but the thought of this stranger dying on his floor, after he had brought her this far, felt like a failure he would not be able to bear. Time lost its meaning in the storm-bound cabin, measured not by the clock, but by the slow, agonizing return of color to May's skin. It might have been 2 days or 3 when the fever finally broke, and the delirium of freezing gave way to the sharp, lucid pain of recovery. When she finally opened her eyes, they were dark and glassy, reflecting the flames of the hearth, and for a long moment she simply stared at the rough-hewn beams of the ceiling, unable to comprehend why she was not dead. She turned her head, the movement exhausted and heavy, and saw the man sitting in the corner, whittling a new handle for an axe, his profile sharp and severe against the shadows. He stopped his work the moment she stirred, the silence between them thick and laden with unspoken questions. "You're safe," Silas said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. He did not move toward her immediately, sensing her fear, the instinctive recoil of a wounded animal waking in a predator's den. May pulled the blankets tighter around her chin, her memory a fragmented glass of laughter, snow, and the sensation of falling. "The wagon," she whispered, her voice a cracked ruin of a sound. "They said it was a shortcut." Silas set the axe handle down and rose, his shadow stretching long across the room, but he kept his distance, moving to the iron pot suspended over the fire. "There was no wagon," he said gently, ladling broth into a tin cup. "Just you and the snow. Drink this." He placed the cup on the floor within her reach and retreated, giving her the space to choose survival on her own terms. As the storm outside finally began to exhaust itself, a fragile routine emerged within the walls of the cabin, a dance of avoidance and necessary proximity. May was too weak to stand for long, her feet bandaged and tender, so she sat by the fire, wrapped in Silas's spare coat which swallowed her small frame, watching him with guarded, intelligent eyes. She saw a man who moved with economy and purpose, who treated the objects of his life, the cast-iron skillet, the rifle, the kerosene lamp, with a reverence born of necessity. He was not like the men who had abandoned her. There was no swagger in him, no performative cruelty, only a quiet competence that seemed to anchor the cabin against the wind. One evening, as the twilight turned the snow outside to a deep, bruising purple, she watched him struggle to mend a tear in his work shirt, his large fingers clumsy with the tiny needle. Without a word, May reached out her hand, the gesture trembling but deliberate. Silas looked up, surprised, and saw not the victim he had carried from the snow, but a woman asserting her place in the world of the living. He handed her the shirt and the needle, and their fingers brushed. A momentary contact that felt louder than the storm had ever been. "My name is May," she said, her voice stronger now, weaving through the silence. He watched her thread the needle with practiced grace, the firelight catching the concentration in her face. "Silas," he replied, the name feeling strange in his mouth after so long unsaid. In that exchange, the dynamic shifted. She was no longer just a burden he had saved, and he was no longer just her captor or savior. They were two isolations that had collided, beginning the slow, terrifying work of knitting together. The days that followed the breaking of the fever were defined by a quiet domestic revolution, a shifting of the cabin's atmosphere from one of survival to one of cohabitation. May recovered her strength not in a sudden burst, but in slow, deliberate increments, much like the winter sun inching its way across the floorboards. She began to take ownership of the small space, her presence filling the voids that Silas had long allowed to remain empty. She organized the tins on the shelf, swept the dust from the corners where the shadows liked to gather, and took over the cooking, transforming his simple rations of salted pork and beans into meals that held actual flavor. Silas watched her with a mixture of wariness and fascination, a man observing a rare bird that had landed on his windowsill. He found himself lingering over his morning coffee, delaying his departure into the cold, just to watch the way she braided her dark hair, or the efficient, graceful movements of her hands as she kneaded dough for biscuits. There was a tension growing between them, a hum in the air that was no longer about fear or danger, but about an awareness of the other person's breathing, their weight on the floorboards, the heat of their body in a room that was always fighting off the chill. He would catch her looking at him when she thought he was focused on oiling his rifle, her gaze dark and searching, trying to decipher the man beneath the silence, and he, in turn, found his eyes drawn to the curve of her neck as she bent over the fire, a sudden, sharp ache in his chest reminding him that he had been lonely for far longer than he had cared to admit. One evening, after a dinner eaten in the companionable silence that had become their language, the weight of their unsaid histories finally became too heavy to ignore. The fire was roaring, casting long, flickering shadows against the logs, and the wind outside had died down to a low, mournful moan. May sat on the rug, mending a tear in her own brown dress, the garment that had been her shroud and was now just clothes again. "They told me this land was gold," she said softly, not looking up from her stitching. "That a man was waiting for me, who would give me a house with glass windows." Silas set his tin cup down, the sound sharp in the quiet room. He looked at her, seeing the steel spine beneath the delicate features. "Gold is just a rock until you bleed for it," he replied, his voice rough. "And men who promise glass windows usually only have bars to offer." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped, hands that could break a horse or mend a fence, now holding nothing but empty space. "Why didn't you go back, when you saw what they were?" May paused, the needle hovering over the fabric. She looked up, her eyes meeting his, and in them he saw a reflection of his own solitude. "There is no back," she said simply. "There is only the snow or the fire. I chose the fire." It was an admission of reliance that struck Silas hard. He reached out, almost involuntarily, and his fingers brushed against her cheek, a touch as light as a snowflake. She did not pull away. Instead, she leaned imperceptibly into his rough palm, her eyes closing, accepting the offer of protection that he did not know how to speak aloud. The first day Silas had to ride out to the distant pasture to check on the herd was a test of the fragile ecosystem they had built. The snow had packed down hard enough for travel, and the sky was a piercing, cloudless blue that offered light but no warmth. As he saddled the roan mare, his movements were jerky and distracted, his eyes constantly flicking back to the cabin door where May stood wrapped in a blanket, watching him. "I'll be back before sundown," he promised, tightening the cinch with unnecessary force. "Bar the door." May nodded, her face pale against the dark wool. "I will be here," she said, and the words sounded like a vow. The hours of his absence stretched like a taut wire. For Silas, the open range felt different now. The vast emptiness, which he had once cherished as freedom, now felt desolate and wrong. He found himself checking the angle of the sun with frantic regularity, pushing the mare harder than usual through the drifts, terror gripping him at the thought of returning to find the cabin empty or cold. For May, the silence of the cabin without his heavy tread was suffocating. She paced the small room, feeding the fire obsessively, every creak of the timber sounding like an intruder. When she finally heard the crunch of hooves on snow and the snort of the horse, she threw the door open before he had even dismounted. Silas saw her silhouetted in the golden light of the doorway, and the relief that washed over him nearly brought him to his knees. He stumbled into the warmth, cold clinging to his coat, and she was there, her hands on his frozen arms, pulling him into the safety of the home he had built but never truly inhabited until she arrived. The thaw came weeks later, a slow, dripping surrender of the winter's grip. The sound of water running in the eaves replaced the howling wind, and the brown earth began to shoulder its way through the white blanket of the plains. With the melting snow came the inevitable reality of the road. One morning, Silas stood on the porch, looking out at the horizon where the pass was finally clearing. The realization sat in his gut like a stone. He turned to find May standing behind him, wearing the mended brown dress, her hair neatly pinned. She looked ready to leave, and the sight of it stopped his breath. "The road is open," he said, his voice flat, hiding the desperation that clawed at his throat. "I can hitch the wagon, take you to the settlement. There's a coach there that goes east." He was giving her the choice he knew she deserved, the freedom to escape the prison of winter and his grim company. May looked out at the muddy, scarred landscape, then back at him. She saw the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the railing of the porch until the knuckles turned white. She stepped closer, invading the space he was trying to put between them. "Do you want me to go?" she asked, her voice steady, stripping away all pretense. Silas looked down at her, seeing the woman who had survived the ice, who had filled his silence with life. "No," he rasped, the word tearing out of him. "I don't know how to be in this house without you anymore." It was not a proposal of marriage in the traditional sense, with rings and kneeling and flowery declarations. It was a negotiation of souls on the edge of the wilderness. May reached out and took his hand, her small fingers wrapping around his callous, scarred fist, anchoring him to the spot. "I have no desire for the east," she said, her thumb tracing the ridge of his knuckles. "I have no desire for glass windows if the house is cold." She looked up at him, her expression softening into something tender and fierce. "I chose the fire, Silas. I choose the man who keeps it." The tension drained from his shoulders, replaced by a profound, grounding weight. He turned his hand to grasp hers, pulling her gently toward him until there was no space left between the rough wool of his coat and the cotton of her dress. He lowered his forehead to rest against hers, a gesture of intimacy that felt more profound than a kiss. They stood there on the porch of the rough-hewn cabin, watching the sun climb over the melting hills, two castaways who had found an island in each other. The world beyond the fence line remained harsh and indifferent, full of judgment and storms yet to come. But as Silas wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her firmly against his side, they both knew they would face it from the same side of the door. The winter had tried to take her, but the spring found her rooted, not as a guest, but as the heart of the land itself.